Welcome to the fourth webinar as part of the NDIS Success Roadmap. Before we start today, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. We pay our respect to them and their cultures and to elders, past, present and emerging. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Dr. Ellen Schuler, and on behalf of the Business Consulting team, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on quality, compliance and risk. The NDIS is highly regulated, and as a provider, you need to understand the NDIS Code of Conduct and the quality and safeguarding rules and regulations. In today's webinar, we will give you an insight into the compliance requirements for registered NDIS providers, and we will also talk about unregistered providers. So please keep watching, even if you're thinking of providing NDIS services as an unregistered provider. There will be content that is relevant to you. If you have not watched the previous webinars, we strongly encourage you to do so. In the first webinar, we gave an insight into the fundamentals of the NDIS. In the second webinar, we discussed the importance of understanding the market you want to operate in. Who are your potential customers? What do they need and want from the NDIS provider? And who else is already providing NDIS services in your area? In webinar 3, we looked at how you can design a service and plan for the NDIS service delivery. We also explained how the service registration groups are linked to the services. After today's webinar, we will still have 2 more webinars to come. In the next webinar, we will talk about how to develop your marketing strategy. And in the very last webinar, we will talk about sustainability in the NDIS, analysing your potential revenue and your associated costs. Financial viability is very critical for long-term success in the NDIS. Please join our NDIS Success Facebook group if you haven't done so yet. The group will keep you up to date with the events, and you can also ask questions, and we will try to answer your questions in our next Q&A session. Alternatively, you can always email us your question. For optimal learning, please download today's activity worksheet and work through the questions in your activity worksheet. In today's webinar, we cover 3 important factors that are interlinked: quality, compliance, and risk. Compliance is your license to operate. You need to be compliant to rules and regulations to be able to offer and charge for services in the market. Compliance sets the benchmark for the quality of service you need to deliver, including who delivers it and how you engage with people with disabilities. Quality of service is about human rights of your participants. The evidence of the Aged Care and the Disability Royal Commission demonstrate how important it is to provide quality services that respect the human rights of the people with disabilities you support. Quality services can only be delivered if you are managing your risks to your customers, to your employees, and to your business. This links back to our previous webinars because quality informs your service design or how you offer your services. Quality can be the point of difference in your market. Quality does not come free, and the cost needs to be considered and integrated into your financial model. So what will we cover in detail today? First, we will look for arguments why it is worthwhile to register as an NDIS provider. We will look at the role of the NDIS Commission and the quality and safeguard rules. We will discuss the NDIS Code of Conduct, which applies to all providers, registered or not. We will look at your obligation as a provider, including worker screening. Should you decide to register, or in case you are already registered, it is important to understand the registration process. We will talk about the NDIS audit and registration requirements. Depending on which service you provide and which registration group you select, you need to demonstrate compliance to different practice standards. We will provide you with an overview over the verification pathway and the certification pathway. Good customer engagement is important in every service provision, and we will talk about how to plan for NDIS supports and what should be included in your service agreement. And any business needs to manage risks. Again, this applies to registered providers and also unregistered providers. At the end of today's session, we will discuss what quality, compliance, and risk means for your business and how you can identify the next steps. Why should an NDIS provider register with the NDIS Commission, and what is the difference between being a registered and an unregistered provider? As mentioned in webinar 1, you do not have to be registered to provide services, with some exceptions. This table compares the requirements of registered and unregistered providers. Both are obliged to provide services that are safe and protect people from harm. All providers need to comply with the NDIS Code of Conduct and help workers to understand and follow the code. Providers are obliged to conduct worker screening and should have compliance management processes in place. If you are an unregistered provider, you still need to do screening depending on the regulations in your state. This might be regulated by the Disability Services Act or Working with Children regulations. A registered provider can provide services to all people with an NDIS plan if registered for that service. Unregistered provider can only provide services to plan and self-managed participants. To register, a provider needs to undergo a registration process and regular audits. We will talk about this in a bit more detail later. This requires the provider to establish quality systems and procedures and to implement them throughout the organization. This involves costs and effort. However, it will ensure a minimum standard across the organization. To ensure compliance, your organization will have to engage in ongoing learning and a continuous improvement program. Ultimately, this will make your service delivery better, and it communicates to your customers that you are actually putting in the effort to keep them safe. There are services that require you to be registered. This includes plan management, specialist disability accommodation, behavior support, or if you are using regulated restrictive practices. Restrictive practices means any practice or intervention that are restricting the rights of freedom of movement of a person with a disability. As discussed in webinar 1, not the provider decides who's plan managed or agency managed. It is actually the participant who can choose in the planning meeting how they want their money managed. So if they choose NDIA managed or agency managed, they can access services only from registered provider. If they choose plan managed or self-managed, they can choose services from registered providers and from unregistered providers. Many people choose actually a combination of how the money is managed in their plan. The registration gives you access to the full NDIS market, regardless of how your plan is managed. With your registration, you're making a statement that you commit to a compliance regime. Participants with the most complex needs are the most vulnerable, and they are more likely to be agency managed. If you decide not to register, you are making a decision not to provide services to them. For non-for-profits in particular, this might not well sit with your values. Reasons not to register might be cost and time. You can still access part of the market, which might be enough for you. Many providers have undergone the registration and audit process, and they have fed back to us that it requires a lot of commitment and hard work, but many have acknowledged that it actually has improved their operation and it has improved the outcomes of their services. Also, the audit provides an independent feedback to your organization. The auditor will most certainly have some good suggestions and recommendations, which provides valuable insight for the leadership team. In being a registered provider, there are costs involved in terms of both time and cash. There's work involved in getting to registration standard and staying there. You need to invest in developing policies and procedures, keep them up to date, and you need to keep good and comprehensive records, forms, registers. And your organization needs to commit in continuous improvement and ongoing learning. The registration as such is free. However, you will have to pay for the audit. And that audit will depend on your registration groups, how many participants you support, and how many outlets your organization has. It is worthwhile to investigate how your registration groups will impact on the ongoing costs and on the cost of the audit. You should factor this into your budget in terms of your startup costs and the ongoing cost of doing business. Let's have a close look at the NDIS Commission and the quality and safeguard rules and regulation. As mentioned in our first webinar, the NDIS and the NDIS Commission are completely separate agencies. The NDIS Commission was established in 2018 to improve the quality and safety of NDIS supports and services. And the Commission is responsible for the NDIS registration in every state and territory except for Western Australia. The Commission will commence operating in WA from the 1st of December in 2020. So if you're watching from WA, your current registration will actually automatically roll over to the NDIS Commission in December. However, a word of warning, there have been hiccups in the past in other states in the rollover. So please make sure your registration groups are up to date now. And in December, please check that the rollover has worked and that you have the necessary registration groups. So the NDIS Commission oversees that providers provide safe and quality services and comply with the NDIS practice standards and the NDIS Code of Conduct. Anyone can lodge a complaint about the NDIS service to the Commission, and if deemed critical, the Commission will investigate or might even refer to the police. The Commission keeps track of reportable incidents and the use of restrictive practices. Providers using restrictive practices need to report to the Commission on a monthly basis. If they're using unauthorised restrictive practices, this becomes a reportable incident, which needs to be reported as well. The Commission is currently establishing a national consistent worker screening database. And the Commission can actually ban workers from working for a registered provider and can also ban providers. Unfortunately, workers can still work as unregistered providers, and we hope to see some legislative changes in that respect. The slow response of the NDIS Commission to the abuse and neglect of Anne-Marie Smith in Adelaide has been criticised. And we hope to see some changes because these have been suggested by an independent review. Under the NDIS Commission, the rules and regulations are nationally consistent. And if you are registered, you can provide services in every state and in every territory. If you're registered, you need to comply with the NDIS practice standards and the NDIS Code of Conduct. The provider needs to maintain a complaints management and resolution system. And this is separate to the incident management requirements and the obligation that the providers are reporting reportable incidents to the Commission on time. NDIS providers are obliged to screen their employees until the introduction of the National Screening Database. Providers need to comply with the state regulations in their state. The NDIS has published a mandatory training module that workers should complete, and there is more. Providers that are supporting people with challenging behaviours need to comply with behaviour support requirements and demonstrate that they reduce and eliminate restrictive practices. And there are rules about the protection and disclosure of information and some technical rules. It seems like a lot, and to be honest, it is a lot, but the rules that apply to you as a provider will depend on what services you are registered for. We've talked already about the NDIS Code of Conduct, but what does it actually mean for providers? Whether you register or not, your organization and your employees need to understand and apply the NDIS Code of Conduct. The NDIS Code of Conduct sets the expectations for appropriate and ethical conduct in delivery of supports and services. It is a human rights-based approach. In providing supports or services to people with disability, a person covered by the code must act with respect for individual rights to freedom for expression, self-determination, and decision-making. The person needs to respect the privacy of people with disability, provide supports and services in a safe and competent manner with skill and care, act with integrity, honesty, and transparency, ensure quality and safety, and take all reasonable steps to prevent and respond to all forms of violence against exploitation, neglect, and abuse of people with disability, and also take all reasonable steps to prevent and respond to sexual misconduct. The Commission has developed individual guidelines for workers and for providers to understand their obligations. We have provided a link to that guideline in our activity workbook. And this guideline is very useful. It is very practical, and it gives a lot of examples in what a worker should do and look out for. For example, if you respect the rights to freedom of expression, self-determination, and decision-making, then you support your clients to make their own decision about their supports. This also means that you communicate in a language that is easy to understand. I have read lots of service agreements drafted by lawyers, very impressive, long service agreements. But I was always wondering, or I'm always wondering, if people with intellectual disability would actually be able to understand those. Also, as a provider, you need to respect values and beliefs. Hence, if you are running a group home and a person would like to attend a regular church service, or if a person in your group home doesn't eat pork or beef for religious reasons, it is actually your obligation to support and respect those preferences. And it is important to assist your workers understand their obligations. There is an online module for workers to understand the obligations as an NDIS support worker. The module is free of charge. It is very easy to understand and it is very, very practical. The Commission website states that providers should include this in their induction program and encourage workers to undertake this module over time. However, the feedback we are actually getting from auditors is that they actually consider this a must. So if you are a registered provider, please put all your workers through this program. And please also keep a record of who has completed the training, because the auditor will most definitely look at those records. So what about worker screening? Every state and territory has specific rules about disability worker clearance, so please make sure you are complying with those expectations. And we also have provided a link in the activity worksheet. In the case of Anne-Marie Smith, the provider had not conducted screening on the majority of their workforce. They had not provided screening actually on the worker looking after Miss Smith. If the provider would have done proper checks, they would have been unlikely to employ that person because there have been inconsistencies reported by previous employers. As mentioned, the NDIS Commission is implementing a national screening database, and we expect this to become live in February 2021. This means if a worker is banned in one state, they will also not be able to work across the border. Also, the NDIS worker screening is required for any NDIS worker, and it is really important to understand the definition, what is an NDIS worker, because that actually includes your key personnel. It includes your board members, your managers, and anyone involved in the direct service delivery and the roles where normal duties are likely to require more than incidental contact. More than incidental contact includes physical contact, face-to-face contact, oral communication, written communication, but also electronic communication. So if you have back office staff, for instance, sending out invoices or doing the accounting, they do not need to require clearance if they don't have interaction with your customers. As a provider, you need to make sure you have full staff lists and identify who is in a so-called risk-assessed role and maintain records that provide evidence that you are screening your NDIS workers. And to be honest, as a matter of due diligence, any provider, registered or not, is obliged to do screening because everyone is obliged to provide safe services. Let's have a look at the registration process. The registration process with the NDIS Commission can take anything between a few weeks or several months in total. It really depends on how busy the Commission is. The Commission is prioritizing new applications, but do not expect a quick turnaround. It varies a lot. So when you complete your online application to become a registered NDIS provider, you need to provide a fair bit of information, including your corporate structure, also where you are planning to provide services, your key personnel, and your screening profile. So what services are you actually planning to deliver? Make sure you select the registration group that you will need for the services that you are going to provide. If you have trouble understanding how registration groups link with the services, please watch our webinar 3. The registration groups determine the NDIS practice standards, which one of those apply to your organization, and based on your responses, the application form will filter you the relevant information. Please select carefully because more complex supports require more evidence and the audit will be more costly. Hence, it does not make sense to pick registration groups for supports that you are never going to provide. For the registration and for any re-registration, you are required to complete a self-assessment against the NDIS practice standards, and only those that are relevant to the supports and services your organization is delivering to participants. Your submission will inform the auditor about your practices, hence you may actually want to put in some considerable effort into the self-assessment. Prepare your documents carefully and gather as much evidence as you can. You are required to upload any documents as evidence. So you need to upload policies, procedures, templates, forms, etc. You have 60 days to complete the assessment. You can save the form and you can always return to it at any time within those 60 days. Also, please be realistic about the numbers of participants that you are supporting because this will impact on the audit sampling size and on the cost of the audit. If you haven't got any participants, that's fine. And that can result or will result in a provisional audit. And the site audit will then happen probably within a year. So after you submitted your online application, you will receive an initial scope of audit and the NDIS Commission will email that to you. And this document summarizes the registration requirements that apply to your organization. So whether you require a verification audit or whether you require a certification audit. It is your responsibility to engage a quality auditor. You will find a list of the auditors on the Commission website. And I think we also provided a link in the activity worksheet. The auditor will use the initial scope of audit document to quote for the services, and our recommendation is to at least get 3 quotes and to actually look at the fine print. Are there any extra costs for travel? Is the auditor actually local? Do the quotes involve only the upcoming audits, or does it actually also involve the midterm audit? You can also discuss your needs and your circumstances with the auditor and negotiate the best value. It is also worthwhile actually talking to other providers about their experience about their audit. The supports and the registration groups determine which NDIS standards apply and if your organization will undergoing a verification or a certification audit. The verification audit is a lighter touch desktop audit. This is required only every 3 years, whereas the certification audit is a more detailed process. It also requires a midterm audit. Both audits will be proportionate to the size and scale of your organization and the supports you are seeking to deliver. So a smaller provider with fewer workers and less participants is not expected to present the same evidence as a big national provider with a large workforce and many participants. To make it easy for you, we have put a list together with all the registration groups and which registration pathway applies. You can find this beautiful list in alphabetical order and also in order of registration numbers on our website. So we have put together some examples of registration groups and which registration pathway actually applies. So for instance, assistive products, therapeutic supports or household tasks, they are low risk services and they have to undergo a verification process. So once you have selected your auditor, they will check with you that the scope of audit is accurate and they will begin the audit process. The auditor will complete their assessment, as already mentioned, in a way that takes your organization's size, scale, and scope and complexity into consideration. So for the verification audit, they will review your policies and your procedure, and they might ask you additional questions. Whereas for the certification audit, you can expect 2 stages. Stage 1 is a document review, and stage 2, the auditor will visit you and your premises, and they will interview staff and they will also interview your clients. Clients may opt out of the interview if they choose not to be interviewed. The auditor should work with you to help you understand the findings and give you opportunities to ask questions. The auditor will submit the outcomes of the audit to the NDIS Commission and they will make a decision, and they will also undertake a suitability assessment of your key personnel. The registration takes a fair bit of time. As mentioned already, the Commission gives priority to new providers rather than to existing providers. But we had feedback that some registration took up to 6 months, but we also heard about 12 weeks periods. If you're successful, the Commission will contact you and will let you know that you're good to go to provide NDIS services. You will be registered for your selected registration groups and for a specific time frame, and normally that is for 3 years. We've already mentioned the suitability assessment, which the Commission will conduct. They will investigate that your key personnel is actually suitable to run an organization of such kind. They will look at any past convictions, whether they've ever been insolvent under administration, if there have been any adverse findings or enforcement actions, or if they have been disqualified from managing an organization. So let's have a little bit of a look at the verification pathway and what is actually expected of providers who are undergoing the verification pathway. Usually, providers requiring a verification quality audit deliver lower risk or lower complexity supports and services. These can be services that are already subject to professional regulations, such as APRA regulations, or Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency. Professional regulation means a practitioner must already meet set standards and is already subject to ongoing monitoring of their competency to practice, and that have to go regularly professional and continuous professional development. So for the verification pathway, you have to work through 4 key areas. There is a human resource management, there is incident management, compliance management, and risk management. And for all those 4 areas, you need to have relevant policies and processes in place and relating documentation. The Commission has published a detailed document which outlines the requirements for the verification module in detail. Again, you can find a link in our activity worksheet. So what are the human resource requirements? The Commission wants to know that your organization has an HR management system that is appropriate for the size of your organization, and that participants are receiving services from qualified and experienced workers, that workers have undergone screening and are suitable to work with people with disabilities. They want to know that you and your team are undergoing professional education and have completed the mandatory training module. They want to know that you hold relevant insurances and that you can provide a certificate of currency of meeting your minimum level of insurance cover. They also want to know that you are actually providing person-centered services and that your customers are happy and satisfied with your service delivery. As mentioned before, you are required to screen anyone in your organization with more than incidental contact with people with disabilities, and that includes your key personnel. So you have to provide evidence that you have screened your management, your executives, and also your board members. So have documents available of everyone in a risk assessed role, and the auditor will check that these records are up to date and that the expiry date, screening expiry dates are recorded and followed up. The NDIS Commission has published which qualification and what experience are expected from workers delivering NDIS services under the verification module. You can find the full list in the publication verification module required documentation. Again, a link you can find in our activity worksheet. Here is an example. So for instance, if you are registering for plan management, registration group 0127 plan management, then you are expected to employ a bookkeeper or an accountant, and this person needs to hold membership with one of the listed organizations. So how many qualified accountants would you have to employ if you want to provide plan management services? If you're a body corporate, you will need one staff member who meets the requirements, but you also need to make sure that all the other staff members can achieve the same standards in their work. If you are an individual or a partnership applying for NDIS registration, then qualifications need to be held by all individuals. If you are going through the verification pathway, your organization also needs to be compliant with the NDIS Incident Management and Reportable Incident Rules 2018. For the audit, you need to demonstrate that incidents are managed well and relevant to you and your services, and that the planned intervention is followed up, and that the organization takes learning from each incident. Most importantly, you need to demonstrate that you include the affected participants in your investigation and in your communication. Providers also have the obligation to notify the NDIS Commission of reportable incidents, which includes death, serious injury, abuse or neglect, unlawful sexual or physical contact, sexual misconduct, including grooming, unauthorized use of restrictive practices. Please be informed that there are strict timelines for your reporting, and you must notify the Commission within 24 hours of becoming aware of the reportable incident or the allegation. Providers also need to provide evidence of how they followed up on the incident within 5 business days. The unauthorized use of restrictive practices can be reported within 5 days. And the Commission has actually published a very detailed guidance document about reportable incidents and what is required, and you can find it on the Commission website. Registered providers also need to comply with the NDIS Compliance Rules 2018 and follow the principle of fairness and natural justice. Complaint management process should be, again, relevant to the scope and the complexity of your supports and to the size and the scale of the provider. It is important that the complaint process is made available to participants in an accessible format, and it also needs to advise participants of how they can get access to advocates and how they can complain to the NDIS Commission. Also, anyone visiting your premise, for instance, contractors or family member, need to be able to lodge a complaint. Hence, you should display how to make a complaint in a prominent place, for example, on your website or in a reception area. Any NDIS provider needs to provide supports and services in a safe and competent manner, and providers need to act on matters that might impact the quality and safety of supports. So hence, providers need to manage risks well. So you are advised to establish a risk management system with policies and procedures that are relevant to the scope and complexity and the size of your organization. You need to identify any potential and actual risk to participants, anyone working in your business and your organization. Many organizations actually have risk registers. However, auditors will want to see that they are up to date and that they are managed effectively. Do you have plans to manage the pandemic? Does the plan enable you to act on issues relating to health and safety of your clients and your staff? Also, how does your organization deal with privacy and information management? Do you have policies and procedures in place? And is your staff trained in those? We have discussed the requirements now for the verification pathway for low-risk NDIS registration groups. Once you have passed your registration, make sure you review those 4 areas on a regular basis. After 3 years, you will need to apply for re-registration. Again, if you're delivering services as an unregistered provider or if you are starting services, you might want to review and implement these requirements, even if you're a sole trader. A lot of these requirements are common sense, and they will help you to keep your clients and yourself safe. These requirements for the verification pathway also apply for the certification pathway. However, there are higher expectations. So let's look at the certification pathway in a bit more detail. The certification pathway is for supports and services that are considered of higher risk and more complex. In a certification audit, providers are assessed against the NDIS practice standards, which may include assessment against the so-called core module and potentially supplementary modules relevant to this type of supports they deliver. These practice standards include core responsibilities or expectations relating to HR, risk management, compliance and incident management, but also the delivery of supports, the delivery environment and the governance and the operational management. The certification pathway includes an audit in year 1, a midterm audit and a 3-year audit, the so-called re-registration audit. The initial audit and the 3-year audit requires a 2-step process. In the first stage of the audit, the auditor will look at your documentation, all your policies and procedures and your written evidence. And in stage 2, they will visit your site or several sites, and they will interview your staff and they will interview your participants. The midterm audit is a smaller audit. The auditor will follow up on non-compliances identified in your last audit or any recent events. Providers undergoing this audit at the moment will most certainly have to demonstrate how they are managing the risk of COVID-19. The auditor will assess whether the organisation maintains its condition of registration. So what are these conditions of registrations? Again, providers need to comply with the NDIS Code of Conduct. The provider needs to comply with the NDIS practice standards, with the core module and any supplementary modules relating to the provider's registration groups. The provider needs to have a complaint and incident management system in place and report reportable incidents on time. Registered providers also need good HR systems that include worker screening processes and the mandatory training. If the provider is supporting people with challenging behaviours, they need to report on the use of restrictive practices. The NDIS Commission monitors these conditions of registration and has the power to suspend and revoke the registration. The NDIS practice standards are a critical part of the registration process and of maintaining your registration. Each of these standards has defined outcomes that the provider needs to achieve. So how will the auditor actually identify that these outcomes are met? The Commission has published a guideline that specifies quality indicators, and these indicators will demonstrate that the provider is meeting the outcomes and that the requirements of the standards are met. Almost all of the registration groups in the certification pathway have to comply with the core module. In the core module, we can find 4 high-level participant-focused outcomes. The first outcome is about the rights of participants and the responsibility of providers. It is about governance and operational management. You need to demonstrate compliance in regards to the delivery of supports. And there are expected outcomes in relation to the environment in which supports are delivered. Under each of these sections, there are expected outcomes. There are 22 outcomes in total, and these can be demonstrated through 87 quality indicators. And the auditors will use these 87 quality indicators to assess your compliance against the NDIS quality standards. So what are these 4 key areas in more detail? The rights and responsibility standards have 5 outcomes, and these are relating to person-centered supports, individual values and beliefs, privacy and dignity, independence and informed choice, violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, and discrimination. The governance and operational management standard include risk management, quality management, information management, feedback and compliance management, incident, HR management, and the continuity of support. You may have noticed that governance is included in this section, so it is important for your board to across all these outcomes. And we recommend that your board actually watches our free governance webinars. You can find them on our website. The provision of support section includes access to support, support planning and service agreements. We will talk about this in a short while. Also responsive supports provision and transition to and from providers. There are also sections on the support provision environment, including safe environment, participant money and property, management of medication and management of waste. Not all of these are mandatory, so depending on what supports you are providing. So if you're not managing any medication or participant money, so then those outcomes don't relate to you and you don't have to have any policies and procedures in place. So we've picked an example to actually illustrate the outcomes and the relating indicators. And we have picked the outcome that each participant accesses supports that respect their cultural diversity, values, and beliefs. The quality indicators state that culture and belief are identified and responded to, and that each participant has the right to practice their culture, values, and belief while accessing your supports. So to demonstrate that your organization complies with these outcomes, you need to have relating policies and procedures in place, and your staff needs to be trained in those policies and procedures. The auditor will look that you have actually identified the different needs of participants. Let's say you are supporting people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So is someone in your organization speaking the language, or do you involve translators if needed? Also, do you keep records of each of your clients' special cultural wishes, and are they actually respected? The auditor will not only look at records, but they will interview your staff and your clients. As mentioned, there are additional standards that apply for some registration groups and supports provided. There are 5 additional standards. The registration group high intensity daily personal activity, for example, has to comply with the core module plus the supplementary module 1, which is called high intensity daily personal activities. Most registration groups have to comply with the core module. There are 2 exceptions. If your organization is only applying for specialist disability accommodation, no other registration group applies. Only the module 5, which is called specialist disability accommodation. However, if you are applying for this registration group plus other registration groups, you will always have to comply with the core module as well as supplementary module 5. If you're a sole trader or a partnership applying for early childhood supports, you need to comply with a verification module plus one of the core practice standards, which is the standard for freedom from violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, or discrimination. How do you actually support your staff in understanding and applying these standards? Do you have induction programs and records? Is your staff, your volunteers, are your contractors trained in these standards, and are training records kept? Do employees understand the significance of the standards and the relevance of their own role? And do you have policies addressing all personnel? Also, do senior staff understand the significance of these standards? Do their role model behaviors that support the standards? How are reports of actual or suspected violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, or discrimination managed? And are these actually reported to the board? And how does the culture of your board underpin those standards? As mentioned before, the practice standards also mention your expectations in regard to support planning and the access to supports. Participants need to be able to access the most appropriate supports and are actively involved in the development of their support plan. The support plan needs to reflect the participant needs, requirements, preferences, strengths, and goal, and these need to be regularly reviewed. To demonstrate compliance, provider need to clearly identify which supports they offer, and this information needs to be available to participants in a language that the participant is likely to understand. Providers also need to explain under which circumstances they can withdraw supports. Most importantly are risk assessments for participants, And this is actually mandatory. And it is an area for non-conformances for providers. Often providers forget to document strategies to treat known risks and also forget to review those regularly. So what about service agreements? Are these compulsory or not? As a provider, you need to act in accordance with the Australian Consumer Law and the NDIS Terms of Business, and it is advisable to have a service agreement with your participants. Legally, you must have a service agreement if you are providing SDI accommodation. You also need a written agreement if your business is registered for GST, and this is required under tax law. The NDIA is not party to the agreement, but it will take action if the terms do not align with the NDIS Act and the NDIS Price Guide. The requirements regarding service agreements are included in the NDIS practice standards in the provision of supports. So you need to demonstrate as an outcome that each participant has a clear understanding of the supports they have chosen and how they will be provided. The quality indicators are that you're actually collaborating with each participant to develop their service agreement, and each participant is supported to understand the service agreement and the conditions using a language and a mode of communication they are likely to understand. Where the service agreement is in writing, the participant receives a copy of the agreement, or a record is made of the circumstances under which the participant chose not to receive a copy of the agreement. So, if case you are developing a service agreement, what should your service agreement contain? It should contain how, where, and when, and what costs and supports are actually delivered. Ideally, this is outlined in a schedule of supports, and I always recommend that providers put this at the very end of the service agreement as a table, everything in one place. It also needs to outline how much these supports cost and how much funding will be required in the NDIS plan. It should also contain, the service agreement should also outline who will actually pay for the services. Is the plan self-managed or plan managed or agency managed? If you are supporting self-managed participant, it is worthwhile to put in payment times. Ideally, your service agreement should also outline how travel charges will be invoiced. It should outline the responsibilities of the customers. For instance, if they cannot make the appointment, please be aware there are cancellation rules in the NDIS Price Guide. Your service agreement should also outline the responsibilities of you as a provider. For instance, what if you need to change the time of your service, or if you have to change your the time. Also, you should have clauses how you will solve your problems and how you provide feedback. Also, you should put notice arrangements into your service agreement. You should put the contact details of the participant, the nominee, and the provider. Also, please include in your service agreement the dates when the service will be reviewed and adjusted, how the pricing will be communicated and updated, and the type of services you provide, and and that they are GST free. Please remember to define who in your organization has the authority to sign the service agreement, and please question whether your participant actually has the capacity to enter into a contract or whether a plan nominee should sign the contract. And please make sure the participant actually understand what is in the service agreement. Make sure You explain it to the participant and make sure the language is easy to understand. Also, stress test your service agreement against NDIS changes. Changes, for instance, for cancellation policies or pricing changes. Also, just because your agreement allows you to implement changes, it means that you have to implement changes if the NDIS allows for it. For instance, we have seen price increases, and sometimes the participant plans are not increased. So please consider the impact on your participants if you are increasing prices, and think about your reputation and your customer relationship. Always communicate with your participant before you implement any changes. So let's come back to managing risks in the NDIS. As discussed earlier, provider need to establish a risk management system that is relevant to the size and to your services. If you manage risk effectively, you are more likely to end up with less complaints, and you won't have any incidents, and you will provide services that are safe. You should use the practice standard quality indicators to develop your risk register. You could work through them step by step and identify where potential risks are and in which areas you're confident and in which areas you should do additional work. We have provided a risk register template in our activity worksheet. So what are your next steps? How will you apply quality compliance risk to your business? If you're a new provider, there are some questions to consider. Do you have to be registered to deliver the planned service? Do I want to be registered to access the full NDIS market? Do I want to register to demonstrate commitment to the NDIS quality standards? It might actually be worth looking at what your competitors are doing. Can I run a financial viable service with or without registration? So please consider the impact of costs and also the benefits on the service quality. If you decide not to register, please remember the code of conduct still applies. If you are a sole trader, it might be viable to absolutely just operate with plan and self-managed participants. And you may already have clients that are outside the NDIS. If registering as a therapist or low registration group, the registration commitments are lighter, but you need to balance the costs and the benefits. Clients are possibly less concerned about being not registered, depending on the services you provide. If you want to grow, you may still want to register to have a broader access to the market. As a larger provider, you are more likely to assess the full market. You are more likely to have already established policies and procedures in place as part of doing normal business, and your customers more likely expect you to be registered. If you're preparing to register, please check whether your preferred registration groups mean registration via verification or via certification. Understand the relevant quality standards, the outcomes, and the indicators for your registration groups. Do you or your worker understand and apply the NDIS Code of Conduct? And remember that everyone completes the online training module. Check that you have the appropriate professional qualifications to deliver your planned service. Ensure you have provisions in place for complaint management, incident management, and worker screening. And check that you have the documentary evidence to demonstrate your compliance. So if you're an existing provider who wants to establish new or growing services, you should ask the following questions. Can I deliver my new or expected services with my existing registration groups? Or do I need to go through the registration process for the new groups? Do I need to scale up my quality and compliance arrangements? What do I need to prepare for the midterm or the certification audit? Do we conduct regular internal audits, and do we engage in continuous improvement? There are resources and consultancies available to help you prepare for the audit. Be careful with buying off-the-shelf audit, off-the-shelf policies won't necessarily be adequate for your organization. They may also not be practical for you, and it means you have not been actively involved in developing those policies, and so you are less likely to own and to commit to those policies. Do pre-audit checks and gap analysis, and those help you identify what you already have and what you still need. Make sure you have a thorough understanding of the NDIS and your registration groups. Also, if you engage consultants, look at their experience and make sure they treat your application confidential. And make sure you engage someone you can work with and someone you trust. The NDIS arrangement change frequently, so please keep up to date with the NDIA, the NDIS Commission website, and any information by peak bodies and professional bodies. So what should we do now? So please review the questions in the activity worksheet and in the business plan template. Please join our Facebook group and post a question or email your questions. The Q&A session will be available on the 22nd of September, and the next webinar will be available on the 29th of September. We also are looking for 8 organizations who want to participate in the second part of the NDIS Success Program. 8 organizations nationwide will work with one of our consultants to develop your NDIS idea from a business plan to a pilot stage. And the consultant will work with you to develop an action plan to get your idea off the ground and to help you to progress your idea to pilot stage. And the consultant will support you in key areas where you need some support. You can apply online for this free support, and the applications are open until the 30th of October. You can apply at any time now. However, you need to watch all the webinars by the end of October. Thanks for watching today, Compliance, Risk and Quality. Bye for now.